So welcome back, everyone, to part 3 of my interview with Natasha Helfer Parker, the Mormon therapist and the Mormon sex therapist. This is our 3rd episode with Natasha, longtime dear friend, former board member of the Open Stories Foundation, host of Mormon Mental Health podcast, which you all need to donate to. We would love that. She's also the host of Mormon Sex Info podcast, which is amazing. She is the executive director or CEO of Symmetry Solutions, which is a therapist sort of network where you can find a good therapist who's competent. One of my dear friends, Kimberly, who specializes in support coaching for trans individuals and probably lots of other things, is one of the many members of your network.
Yes, I have wonderful people. So
please,
all meant to specialize on faith transitions and sexuality. Yes.
So check out Symmetry Solutions for your needs if you need therapy. And so we're back for part 3, Natasha. We've talked about your upbringing in the church, your sexual activity prior to marriage, getting kicked out of BYU, the shame that you experienced getting married to Andy, why you became a marriage and family therapist and later a sex therapist, and how your open policy on masturbation being a gift from God. Again, we need a primary song called Masturbation is a Gift from God in Natasha's church, I guess we should say. And and how that position led to you being blacklisted by the LDS Church as not only as a source for referrals, but also as just a therapist that members were discouraged from, referring. So Natasha, let's talk about your faith journey. When did all of this or other things start putting cracks in your Orthodox beliefs?
Well, and it's such an interesting story for me because it's so maybe not, but for me it feels atypical to what I normally see with all of my clients, which is that for me, I feel like my faith journey and transition really was through my clients. It was years and years of seeing people suffer in situations that I felt were unnecessary. So even from a very believing, more Orthodox believing stance, I was having some of those concerns. And that's continued to the point where then I had to start thinking about how it was affecting me and my perspective on truth claims, or, some of those things that we talk about kind of in classic Mormon story rhetoric, right, around what faith transitions look like. But I feel like I've been in faith transition really for most of the 20 years I've been practicing. And very early on, I had mixed orientation marriages that were coming for help. I had people who were experiencing faith transitions and how they were being dealt with their spouses or their family members or ecclesiastical leaders. And even in my very believing days, I felt this isn't right. We're not treating this correctly. We're not giving enough resources. We're not offering things, and people are using our doctrine incorrectly. So I probably had more of that stance, that people just don't understand the gospel in the way that I do, because I'm so smart. So it's just like, but I feel like there was real truth in that we were using gospel principles, I felt, in incorrect ways.
Okay. So that started causing you to question a little bit.
Yes. And I'm sorry that my dog is barking.
No worries. That's part of life.
Okay.
So when did things start getting really, really significant or serious as it related to your faith?
Well, and I don't know what
faith.
Significant or serious means. I mean, I would say that, probably after my move here to Wichita, Kansas is when things started heating up. It's when I met you. It's when I started listening to some of your things. So even though we were very aware of some of the historical issues, hearing other people's perspectives was eye-opening in that respect. And I started doing mostly faith transition work, right? From that point on. Do you want me to?
No, it's fine. Keep going.
Okay,
no,
I'm sorry. So Andy and I start talking a lot more, and we're not always on the same page at all, or things that bother me don't necessarily bother him, and the things that bother him aren't the things that necessarily bother me. So it's a constant dialogue around some of these issues, but always from the perspective more of like, this is something that some of my clients are dealing with, or this is something that I came across. It's never like, this is what I think, right? It's more like, what do you think of this stuff that's happening around us? So it took a long time to be more personal, I guess is why I mean that my journey is a little bit more atypical. Obviously, writing the blog post was a big shift because I knew I was going to be treated differently, even though at that point I considered myself still I was an active member of the church. I'm pretty sure I still had my temple recommend at that point when I wrote that blog. But I knew that writing that blog, I would have to shift some of my boundaries with the church. And so, for example, I never went in for a temple recommend interview after writing that blog piece, because I didn't want to put myself in the position where somebody would have the authority to tell me that I was unworthy when I did not feel that I was unworthy.
So you haven't sought a temple recommend for 5 years?
Correct.
Okay, that's hard.
And that was my own choosing, and it was very hard because I'm not one that necessarily had negative experiences in the temple. I definitely understand problematic issues with the temple, especially from gender role perspectives. But for the most part, my temple experiences were very positive and very much a part of my spiritual worship. So it was very difficult to put myself in that position where I knew pretty much if they had treated me professionally in the way that they had, that they weren't necessarily going to turn around and give me a temple recommend. So I just didn't want to put myself in the position to have that happen.
Right. Okay. But that's hard because it's not because you didn't believe.
Correct.
And so you're sort of giving up one of the major benefits or rituals or ordinances or sources of spiritual strength or rites of passage or just basic activities that devout Mormons engage with. You're sort of 5 years ago decided to give that up.
Correct.
What was that like?
It wasn't good.
I mean, some people don't like the temple. So for some people it's actually
right. Yeah. For me,
up.
it wasn't like that. I would still enjoy going to the temple today if I had that opportunity. So.
Okay. So you stopped going in for temple recommend interviews. How else did it progress?
And, you just start noticing, I had created some boundaries anyway with my ward, which I understand is problematic. Like I had told them even before any of this, like, look, I'm a therapist and I know, I've tried to have all kinds of different boundaries with my ward and my stake. And most of those boundaries that I've tried to create fail in one way or another. Like I remember back when I very first started working with Mormons, I'd say, well, I'm not going to work with anybody in my ward. And then I would refer people out and they wouldn't go. So if they couldn't see, like I said, if they couldn't see a Mormon, they wouldn't go to see anybody. So then I felt queasy about that. Or somebody who I was seeing in the stake level now would move into my ward. So they weren't in my ward, but now they are in my ward. So do I just abandon them because they're now in my ward, right? So I went to a lot of ethics conferences about small community type therapists and how they manage. So if you live in a town where there's only like 5,000 people, how do you, you're at PTA meetings and you're interacting with people in your community who also know you as the therapist. And so I went to a lot of those types of ethics type conferences to understand some of these dynamics that we need to be mindful of as therapists when we're dealing with confidentiality issues. So I decided when I moved here to Wichita that I would create some boundaries, even as a completely believing active Mormon, that I had never created before, which was I would not accept a calling where I was in a presidency. And I would not, so in other words, I would only accept teaching type callings because I feel like that's part of what I can do professionally. I can teach, I can give firesides. I've done that I can't tell you how many free seminars I've given to the church on marriage and family therapy through firesides or youth events or whatever. And I love doing that. But that's a teaching. So I feel like I can be a teacher. You can show up if you're my client and you're interacting with me differently than we're sitting at a presidency meeting. And that's a problem. And I don't ever want to be in a position where I say something like, oh, well, I would love to be the second counselor, but your first counselor is one of my clients, so I have to decline. I never wanted to be in that position. So I just told the bishop, look, I just can't take callings where I'm in a presidency. And I can't be a visiting teacher because I don't ever want there to be this conversation, well, that person can't be my visiting teachee, or because they're going to know, just even if I don't say they're my client, they're going to know that there's some reason there why that person. So we set up this thing where one of my friends from out of state is my official visiting teacher, and I just don't visit teach. And that's just kind of how we set it up at that time. And so I had some of these weird boundaries anyway that I could tell made people uncomfortable, especially my bishop. I remember him saying, people who don't visit teach, that's a slippery slope. It's like you're asking to not do this, and then next time you're going to ask not to do that. And so, I think he was concerned about me or my boundaries or whatever. So, and I understand that it's not part of our cultural makeup to know how to have these boundaries. But then I just noticed, so they put me in as Relief Society teacher. And I forget if this was after or before my masturbation post, but they wanted me to give a lesson on Bednar's talk, and it was all about pornography. And I was usually the teacher who would teach on the fourth Sunday. So it was kind of like perfect for me to be this teacher. Plus I was the mental health person. So they thought that would be great. Well, by this time, I'm deep into my sex therapy training. I pretty much understand that everything Bednar's talking about in regards to pornography is a disaster, and that we have lots of cultural issues around this whole topic to begin with. So I decided to take the 3 sentences that I could find in Bednar's talk that I agree with and focus the lesson on those 3 sentences and on sex positivity within Mormonism, and really talk about that and not have it be so much about pornography. And I can guarantee you that I said nothing in this lesson that would go against church doctrine, but we were talking about sex and sexuality in a way that we're not used to talking about in Relief Society. And I did mention the word clitoris. So that was probably a bit much for
in
my
your
front
Relief
row.
Society lesson.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I was trying to say this idea that, isn't it beautiful that as women, we were created with a part of our bodies that was meant only for sensation, that its only purpose, sensation. And hopefully, for the most part, that's supposed to be for pleasure. If you think about Heavenly Mother and Heavenly Father creating us, and this idea that Heavenly Mother is created like us, and so that we can, this is kind of sex therapy work I do with a lot of Mormons, is helping us have healthier relationships with our own genitalia, which even outside of Mormonism, we're very harsh on genitalia, right? It's dirty, stinky, awful, yuck. We just don't do a good job of honoring genitalia in our overall culture. And here we have this beautiful principle in Mormonism where our bodies are a gift and we're created to be like deity. And so deity, not that we ever talk about Heavenly Father having a penis or Heavenly Mother having a vulva, but that's implied that they have the same body parts that we have. And isn't that beautiful? So I went into that just a tad, and I mentioned the word clitoris and, the back part of the room, which tends to be the younger women, were smiling and nodding, and there were certain people that were not smiling and nodding, and that was the last time they let me teach Relief Society. So, and I asked because it was one of the counselors who came and told me that they would no longer need me in this calling, and so I asked, well, does this have to do with my last lesson? And he said yes, and I said, well, I would really appreciate it if you wouldn't release me. You would let me teach one more time. Just let me teach one more time so that it's not obvious to everybody that I basically got fired for teaching a sex positive lesson in my ward. And they declined that. So they did not allow me to teach again. So for me, that was very sad because I really was very careful to not say anything non-doctrinal. And I felt it was really tapping into some of the sexual positive messages that we have within Mormonism that could be so helpful to so many marriages. And they just shut it down. Now, granted, I'm in the Bible Belt. I'm in a conservative area anyway. I'm not saying that this would have been my experience in every Mormon ward. I think my particular ward has a certain personality, like all wards do. They all have their own personalities. And this wouldn't have
The
necessarily
Midwest,
happened.
the Midwest, Kansas, Iowa, Indiana, it can be really harsh,
Oh yeah. Yeah. There's a whole nother level of sexual shaming that's going on in these areas for
Yeah,
sure.
maybe sometimes we think Utah is the most conservative place, but
No,
sometimes it's not.
no, there's much worse.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so around what year were you released as teacher?
So I'm guessing this was about 3.5 years ago.
Okay, so
Um,
2013, 2014.
yeah, it was probably
Okay,
about 6 months or so before what we'll go into probably our story with Isabella. But so
okay,
at that point, they offered me a job in the primary, I think, and I needed space because I was very angry and upset, and so I just declined that. I said, I think I'm just going to need some space to recover from this, and I just will not have a calling for a little bit. So give me a few weeks or months, and we can talk about it again as far as what calling I can do.
okay.
Because I was extremely upset. I may seem very put together in these types of sessions, but I do sometimes feel sorry for my leaders that have to deal with my wrath and my not so great political comments. So in that sense, they've been very patient with me. And I do want to say too, that even though like I think you mentioned the words blacklisted, like they don't refer to me anymore. One of the things that's been very, very wonderful about where I'm at is that nobody has disciplined me. Nobody has called me in to this day and asked to have a session with me or threaten my membership or, so in that way there's been issues where I feel like I've been professionally disrespected, and there's been ways that I feel like I've been very professionally respected. So I want to give credence to both of those sides.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm guessing the story with Isabella might be next. Is that right?
Yeah, so then we're plugging along, and this is the stage where I'm probably coming home every Sunday ticked off about somebody said something. Why did the guy who only spoke about Satan and did a whole poem about Satan, and he didn't get fired from his job, but my clitoris lesson fired me, so Andy's having to hear, me constantly being upset about Sunday lessons and things that are being talked about that I don't agree with. And I think too that there was a time in all of this where I probably was what I would deem clinically depressed. I mean, I think that there was probably 4 or 5 years here in Wichita where this whole process of trying to be a change within our church and trying to be helpful and trying to reach out and then being rejected over and over and over again by my own people was very, very taxing. And then Wichita in general is just not my cup of tea as far as it's a conservative area, it's Republican. So, all these ways that I just didn't really fit either in my church or my community really left me kind of in a low spot of my life for probably about 4 or 5 years. In fact, I may still be climbing out of that. Who knows?
Oh, so for a lot of people, they stay in the church to try and change it from within. For you, sounds like that was a little bit toxic or draining.
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, on the one hand, when you have clients who tell you, oh my goodness, this is so useful and this perspective is so great, and it feeds you and it makes you feel like, wow, I am making a difference. And then there's other times where you feel like you're making no headway. In fact, you're getting pushed even further back. And I didn't want to leave my religion. I mean, I'm a Mormon. I'm not looking at it from, oh, this is toxic for my mental health, so I will leave. No, I'm a Mormon, and Mormons, push carts through countries, and you don't get an out just because it's hard or because it's damaging to your mental health, right?
What does that have to do with being Mormon? That has nothing to do with it.
If you die on the plains, that's just part of the story. So so that wasn't even how I was thinking about it. I wasn't even thinking about it from the perspective, but Andy, who tends to be a little bit more traditional in his Mormonism than I do, he started saying things like, if church is making you so miserable, maybe you should take a break from church, or you just seem angry a lot of the time, or it's seeping into other areas of your life. You know, kind of a lot of the complaints that you hear people's spouses having when somebody's going through a faith transition, right? All you do is you only interact with internet people. What local friends do you have? You know, he was giving me that feedback, and I was fairly resistant to that feedback. I didn't want to hear it, you know, because I'm so smart.
Right. And you love Mormonism.
Yeah, and I loved Mormonism.
Yeah.
And I did feel like some of the things that I was working on were positive. I like having my blog. I like doing the podcasts. I love my relationships with many of the people that I've met through this whole world, right? Like you and so many other Mormon therapists. And it's just, in some ways, it's very, very edifying. And you feel like, wow, we are making a difference. And then other times it just is engulfing in despair, you know? So it's a roller coaster ride for sure.
So what changed things for you?
Well, so we're in the middle of having these types of conversations. I didn't do any of those things. I didn't take a break, but now our daughter, who is, 14 at the time, she has an experience.
During the ordained women thing, right?
Did I?
Wasn't it kind of during the ordained women sort of
right.
uproar?
Right. So I filled out a profile, and as usual with all of my kids, I tell them about all kinds of things that are happening. And so Isabella was interested in doing a profile.
An ordained women profile on their website where people wrote a little snippet to show their support for female ordination. So you wrote one.
Yes.
And published it. That's a big deal, because back then
fairly early on.
That could get you in a bishop's office just for doing that.
Yep. And we wore pants to Sunday on the pants day, and my sons I sat down with them and explained the whole purple thing. And if anybody wanted to do that, they could. And if they didn't want to do that, they didn't have to. And they wore their purple ties. And so it was kind of a family event to participate. I don't know that anybody in my ward even knew what we were doing, but we just showed up in our pants and in our purple. And so we were part of that movement. And with a lot of anxiety, all the time. It's like I'm constantly pushing these boundaries in my ward. And I know it. I know that they're probably sick of me or thinking I'm contentious or constantly bringing up problems. And on the other hand, I want to be, I want to stand by the things that I believe in and, Mormon my way, do what's right, let the consequence follow.
Right.
So we did all those things. And, and Isabella, I remember distinctly, it's amazing how these things hurt still so much. But I remember one time when she was at Beehive, she looked over at me and she's like, why does, this young girl, we're in a small ward, right? There's probably 20, maybe 15 young women in the whole program. And so there's like and at the time there were two beehives, and my daughter was one of them. And so she looks over at me at sacrament meeting because this other girl had just gone up and been made the Beehive president. And she looks at me and she's like, why, Mom, do you think that I don't ever get a calling? Why am I never? And she hadn't. Her whole Beehive experience, she never received a calling. So she wasn't the secretary. She wasn't the first counselor. There was two of them. And there was a president, and then there was Isabella. And she asks me, well, why do you think that I don't have a calling? And so I look down on her and I'm like, I don't know, honey. It's a good question. And she says back very clearly, and she says, I think it's because you're my mom. And I just said, I think you're right. I think that is why. I think that, I take certain positions and I say certain things at church that make people uncomfortable, and it's unfair, but then all of you are part of my family and we're all treated a little bit differently, And again, not that anybody was ever super rude to us or inappropriate, but just a general sense that we don't fit. And Andy and I had talked about that for a long time, and we have always felt like, you know what, it's okay for kids to be part of communities where they don't fit. Things don't have to be perfect, and it helps them deal with conflict. And so we don't need it to be perfect in our Mormon ward to be a part of it. It's just kind of like extended families or whatever, there's just issues. So we were never completely turned off by that or feeling like we needed to protect our children from a more conservative ward than what we've lived in the past. But I didn't expect us to be living here throughout the majority of my child's upbringing either. So this has completely shifted our ability to raise our kids in a Mormon way that I felt I wanted to, right? So there's a lot of power that was taken away from me in that regard. 14 comes along, Isabella's made the Maya Maid president. So this is huge, huge for her. Like, not only did she finally get a calling, but she's the president of the Maya Maids. And you couldn't see a girl more excited. More excited to serve. And I mean, I never had to be the mom, to say, oh, have you made your phone calls? Or have you, remember Sister So-and-so had this task that you needed to do. She was on top of it. She was calling the inactive girls. She was trying to figure out activities everybody would feel comfortable at. She was just gung-ho. And on top of it, she had worn pants to the Sunday meeting where she was set apart. And so she just came home thrilled, like I'm finally being supported, and even wearing pants, they're comfortable setting me apart as the Maya Maid president. Like there's hope for this church of mine that maybe I haven't felt like I totally fit into, right? This is where my daughter's coming from. And I feel hopeful too. I'm like, this is amazing. And the young women's leader at that point was wonderful. This wonderful woman who I could tell also was just a little nuanced in her perspectives and very open to my daughter, and just really my daughter loved her very much. So just a wonderful person to have elevated my daughter in this way. And then it must have caught wind that Isabella had written this ordained women thing. Plus, Isabella had always been part of the Straight Gay Alliance club at school, like, listening to me and some of her own sexual spectrum type things that she was thinking about at the time. And so that's an organization that she always was a part of. And so she gets called into the bishop's office I'm guessing about 2 or 3 months after she was called as president. And unbeknownst to Andy and I, who had asked for our children not to be called into an office without us being there. So she was called in there. And I had always told my kids, look, up until you're 16, I want to be in the office if the bishop or anybody else is going to talk to you, mainly because of all the sex questions I feel is none of their business and they shouldn't even be asking. But then after 16, we'll talk about it. I hadn't had to deal with that yet. But I said, but if you ever want to go talk to the bishop on your own volition, I'm never going to stop you from doing that. So I just wanted to put a safety guard there. I mean, not that I think my husband's a pedophile or anything, but if my kids need to go talk to an adult without me and Andy being present for whatever reason, they should have a place to do that. But not the other way around, where an adult gets access to my kids just because that's the tradition of the times and ask them inappropriate questions that I don't agree with. So that's kind of how we had navigated that up until that point. So I walk into this office because the bishop does finally come and get us, and my daughter's in tears, and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, like something happened here where she felt she had to go talk to the bishop and couldn't talk to her parents. And now we're going to hear some dramatic thing that's been happening in her life that I've been unaware of. That's really what I thought going into that meeting. And, but really quickly we start understanding that he is concerned about her involvement in GSA and her involvement with ordained women. And the stake president happened to be there
GSA
as
is
well.
the Gay Straight Alliance
the Gay Straight
at the high
Alliance,
school, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And the stake president was there. He kind of, I think, understood that something was going down. So he came into the meeting as well. And so the bishop basically asked her two questions. He said, do you believe, and this was after some of the comments from the ridiculous comments that were coming from church headquarters around some of these things, because there were several people being disciplined for all these kinds of different reasons at the time. But he said, do you believe that gay people, homosexual people should have the right to get married? And she said, yes. And he said, and do you believe that women should have access to the priesthood? And she said, yes. And then he said, well, those two beliefs disqualify you from being the Mine president, and we will now have to release you from your calling. And the stake president backed him up on that, on those two things. Now, we had had about an hour's worth before then of discussion of all kinds of things, like doctrinal changes in the church and how things aren't always, there's a difference between believing that somebody should have a civil right versus believing that it's a value of God, or, all those kinds of arguments went nowhere. And of course, I had a royal fit. I did my whole thing where I just was very, very angry with both of my leaders and asked some very difficult questions to them about how they were conducting their business, including why does my bishop not know about the essay of the blacks in the priesthood? So that was a question I asked my stake president, and whether or not he was training his bishops correctly. So it was that tone that I took, which was not very friendly, obviously. But my child was under attack, so I have no apologies for that. And I turned to my daughter. My one good thing about that whole meeting was I turned to my daughter and I just said, you've done a very Mormon thing here today, which is stand up for your beliefs in a setting that is inappropriate. And there's a power differential there that was unfair for you to experience for an hour alone. And then I think my husband was quiet most of the time, which is unlike him, but he said something along the lines of, you've made a very deep mistake with our daughter here today. And we left. And then we're in a position where we have to decide as parents, this is more than just an uncomfortable place to be in. This is a place where our daughter's not going to be allowed to be a leader, where our daughter's not going to be allowed to develop her own critical thinking, where she's not going to be allowed to see her relationship with deity, if she chooses to have or believe in deity, in a way that would be healthy and uplifting to her, where she's going to be seen as wrong and incorrect and broken and, all those things.
A little bit like you were as a teen after having sex.
Oh, yeah, for sure. So at that point, we decided to stop attending the LDS church. And it just blows my mind that this is, and we would have never stopped attending.
Now, you were both Andy was still an Orthodox believer, right?
I would say definitely more Orthodox than me, but not necessarily literal completely. Yeah, even at the time, he had a very working understanding of church history and
still committed to the church.
But still very committed to the church, yes.
And you were too. And you were too.
Yeah, we were active members of the church, going every week.
And so if somebody said, oh, well, they were just offended and so they walked away, what would you say?
Well, I would say that it was much more, we've been offended for years. My spirit and my clients have been offended for decades, right? But it really came to this parenting decision of, am I going to take my child who was already questioning Christianity, who was already questioning Mormonism, to a place where if there was any desire for her to have a relationship with God, where that relationship I felt would be damaged. Or are we going to take her to other places and show her other forms of Christianity or other forms of spirituality, where if she does want a relationship with deity, she can develop that in a much healthier way? And that was our decision. Now, 4 years later, she's about to go off to college, and we have a 14-year-old son who is very has remained active in the scouting program, and we've completely supported that, and has some friends who are Mormon and invite him to church on a regular basis. And so we are now preparing to go back into activity at some level to support our 14-year-old son, who is having a very different relationship with Mormonism and who wants to explore that and wants to understand if that's a possibility for him. So that's where we're currently at. So I feel like Andy and I are not getting to have our own faith journey. We're just having our faith journey from the perspective of our kiddos and things of that nature.
So how do you feel about going back to church, Natasha Helfer Parker?
Well, there's parts of that I dread, as far as the looks and the tensions and the anxieties of that. And there's parts of me that miss Mormon church, and there's parts of me that hate aspects of Mormon church. So I'm sure it's going to be a wonderful mixture of all kinds of stuff that I'll be feeling.
And as part of your ability to do that Isabel's going away to college, and so you won't be splitting up the family and you can go and...
Right. And it just kind of happened to coincide. If our 14-year-old had expressed this interest earlier, I think we would have figured something out where we could honor both of them. But up until this point, everybody's been happy going to other churches that we've been visiting here in the area. And it's been actually a pretty nice family experience to visit other denominations and talk about things in different ways.
So you're feeling mixed about going back to church?
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
What some hate this question, but I ask it. I know that you don't support the church's views on sexuality, on being LGBT, on, the November 15th, the November 2015 policy, its stance on women and authority and all that stuff. Do you, how do you feel about allowing your son to be a part of that? And then also now attending again and giving your reputation and maybe even time to an organization that represents things that you seem to fundamentally oppose. How do you do that?
Well, so the thing that comes to mind in answering that question is, how am I a part of my extended family? So there are people in my extended family that are a disaster and who've hurt me tremendously. There's parts of my extended family that are amazing. And even my own parents, for example, when I think about the ways that they probably harmed us and the many, many ways that they supported us and loved us. And for me, systems has never been an all or nothing thing. There's potential for harm. There's potential for good. At some point, sometimes the harm is so great that it is toxic and you have to be more clear with boundaries and even have cutoffs. So I get that. And some people may very well feel that way about the church. And I think for very good reasons. For example, if one of my children were LGBT right now, I would not be considering, even if they wanted to go back, or I would have to figure out some way to honor that, but be very, very cautious to have resources in place. I think, even with my son, it's interesting, like he came to us a few weeks ago asking to go to youth conference. And so I just kind of have to laugh at my response. It's like, well, you can go to youth conference, but if you come back all guilt-ridden about stuff that I don't feel you should be guilty about, we're going to have a serious conversation. I felt like I was kind of giving the type of talk you'd give to a kid, like who wants to go to their first rave party or something, right? Like, I'm like, 70% of the stuff you'll hear there is probably fine, but 30% of it is crap. And you're not going to be one of our kids and, fall prey to these kinds of dynamics. And so, we've been very open with our kids about what we feel our issues are with the church. That doesn't mean that they couldn't go and reject us. I understand that there's that risk, that my son could get involved and look up to a young man's leader and maybe consider me and his father less than because we're not the typical Mormon parents. So I understand that there's that risk involved. And at the same time, I believe strongly in honoring my kids' journeys too, and helping them develop in ways that they seek out. And there are worse things, like you say often, there are worse things than a kid who's an active Mormon. But and it was interesting to hear my husband say to our son, my main issue would be that if you somehow respect us less as your parents because we don't fit the mold, like that would be very hurtful. to me as your dad. And maybe that's partly because he felt that way about his dad. I don't know, so we understand these are complex issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm a bit taken back by how much the church has hurt you in some ways, and yet you're still willing to give it another chance, and assessing that as a parent, you feel comfortable allowing your son to re-engage, even though he could be hurt too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you think through that? Knowing that he could end up like Isabella if he says or believes the wrong thing.
Mm-hmm.
How do you let that happen? And
I think it's the same reason why I don't homeschool. Not that there's anything wrong with homeschooling, but a lot of times for a lot of people, I think the motivation to homeschool is a protective one. And I don't feel like my role is necessarily to protect them from negative experiences or people, or to a point, right? To a point, and that they're going to have to learn how to manage those things. So I need to educate them. I need to give them my opinions. But at 14, 15, 16, 17, those are formative years where they need to start making some of their own decisions, and we can support that. Whether it's I want to be an atheist, or whether it's I want to have sex, or whether it's I want to go back to Mormon church. And I think those are things I want to honor for my kiddos.
Right. So you're letting him have his journey, and that there may be trouble, but I'm imagining that there could be trouble any path he takes. And so, like you said, even though maybe it wouldn't be your ideal path for him, there are worse things than having your kid be active in Mormon.
Yeah, I think so. Plus, just like in therapy, I mean, most of these podcasts, we talk about the negative stuff. We talk about the pain. We talk about the hurt. But I could probably do a whole podcast on how the church has helped me, and the role that it played in my family's life, especially as we were somewhat of a gypsy family moving from place to place, and that it always had extended. It is like my extended family. Mormonism is like my extended family. We really didn't have extended family. My mother's an only child. My father, and all my family from her side is 1,000 or more miles away in Argentina. And then my father's family, he only has one brother. We don't have very much contact with them. So for me, family life was Mormonism. And just like families hurt you, they also love you. I mean, some of my most warm and spiritual moments are in Mormonism. I mean, I have been lifted by so many people who've cared for me and loved me and befriended me and served me and my kids. So I think sometimes it's unfair when we only focus on the negative, right? And I feel this way even with my clients. Like a lot of times I'll be asking questions and they'll tell me something pretty awful that happened in their family. But then they're quick to tell me, but that doesn't mean that they're awful. Right? They want me to know that just because my dad, spanked me too hard, he was also really good, in this way. And I get that. I get that you don't want to paint this picture that it was all awful, even though there were awful things that happened. And how do we validate both sides of that coin, right? So I feel like that's been my relationship with Mormonism, is that it's my family. And with family comes great joy, and with family comes great pain.
So what aspects of Mormonism, well, first of all, let me check in with listeners. So listeners have said a lot of things. Jeffrey writes, it's worth noting that we are 4.5 years, after ordained women that, he said 4.5 years after Wear Pants to Church Day, the LDS Church just authorized female employees to be able to wear pants. So that's a news breaking story that in 2017, the LDS Church in June around the 27th of June is now allowing their women employees to wear pants. So that's Jeffrey's comment. Jill says, Natasha, you save lives. Steve writes, I'm always shocked to see how the LDS Church continues to drive away such incredible members. So he's talking about your and Andy's decision to step away from the church. Steve also writes, I hope your son has a better experience. Let's see. William writes, you're looking great, John. Thank you, William. That's good to know. Bethany writes, it is a very serious thing all around with teenagers and children, lots of deep thinking. So she's basically saying the stakes can be very high with teenagers and children in the church.
Yes.
Glenn writes, I've been on all 3 hours. This has been an incredible recording. So Glenn Glenn has stayed with us the full 3 hours. So thanks, Glenn. We appreciate it. And Ann agrees. Ann says, agree. I can't turn it off. So Natasha, people are glued to their computer screens.
Oh my goodness.
Loving your story. Dana writes, how hard it is to feel ostracized from your Mormon family. I understand completely. It's heartbreaking. That's true. Jeff wants to know, what other denominations did you attend with your family?
Well, so we've gone quite a bit actually to the Community of Christ, which is our more liberal cousins, and they're great. And Isabella actually did a youth camp with them over the summer one time and loved it. We've gone to several of the evangelical type churches, and there's one in particular where there's kind of a fiery pastor, and he just is really humorous and brings great life into the scripture stories that Andy was like, if we ever go back to church, I'm going to have some great scripture stories for my sacrament talks. So he's been good that way. And then we've been to some like non-denominational spiritual type things. We've definitely been involved with Oasis, which is the branch that is trying to do not religious, but like spiritual community, or not even spiritual, just community without the church, without the religion, right? So I've done, and Wichita just started a chapter here. So we've been attending their thing often. And so just a variety of things. We probably could be a little bit more proactive, but Sundays are busy and life is busy, and I would have liked to go to the Unitarian Church by now. I would have liked to we have a great Muslim kind of convention center here where I know they do tours. We did a Greek Orthodox tour in the church that they have here that's also very beautiful. So there's more things I'd like to explore.
Love it. Melissa writes, I've been listening and getting all my housework and laundry done today. So you're helping Melissa.
That's good.
Do her work. She says she loves listening to Natasha. Richard writes, Natasha, I'm convinced that the LDS teaching that violations of the law of chastity are worse than all other sins except murder and blasphemy against the Holy Ghost are very damaging teachings on many levels. Will you please take a few minutes and share your thoughts? I think you've kind of addressed that in your first couple episodes, but anything you want to add other than it's horrifically damaging?
Yeah. No, I agree. And I spoke to this in the paper that I wrote, but this idea that, murder is you're taking a life and unwanted pregnancies, you're giving a life, and both are unsanctioned. There's just no comparison of those two things. First of all, we have caveats for murder, as far as war and other reasons why it's actually even appropriate to take a life that I think is always ethically complicated, but as a society and as different cultures, we have to grapple with that. But to compare, two people in a moment of passion, even if they feel like it's a mistake later on, to have that even in the same sentence has anything to do with the criminal act of murder is just so ridiculous. And so, just so, what's the word when it just has an impact on you. And when you think about these young kids of ours and when they hear all this language, first of all, we never talk about what we're really talking about. It's like sexual sin. Well, what does that even mean? I mean, most of them are masturbating, right? So 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, I can't tell you how many adolescents. This was part of my decision to write my blog post. That the month before I published my blog post, I had seen 4 adolescents who were self-cutting like actual, what we would call self-abuse. I'd seen a missionary who came home from his mission due to anxiety, and I'd seen all 5 of those had to do with masturbation guilt. And on top of it, I had seen 3 other adolescents that were being referred to addiction treatment centers for viewing pornography or masturbating. And we're talking about like less than 1 time a month. I'm just like, what in the hell are we doing? Like, this isn't Mormonism. This isn't even doctrine. This is nothing. This is like a cultural tradition that is gone out of whack. And you see it not only in Mormonism, there's sex addiction treatment centers being built left and right here in the Bible Belt. There's all this media attention on people like Tiger Woods and Wiener, whatever the hell we're doing in this country that comes from a puritanical background that is ridiculous. And it's affected our Mormonism, but it is not doctrinal. And yeah, I'm super comfortable saying we need to be called to repentance on this crap that is psychologically and sexually abusing our children. It's, like I said, it's just bullshit.
Well, don't hold back, Natasha.
I'm sorry.
No, it's awesome. No, I agree. I think, I've now have 7-8 years counseling or coaching Mormons, and I would compare, I would say in some ways the LGBT Mormon experience is incomparable, but in terms of quantity and volume of people affected, and sometimes in terms of severity and intensity, I think this plague around porn and masturbation and the shame and the guilt it causes is its own epidemic. And I have seen people driven to the point of deep depression, self-abuse, meaning cutting or other types of things, or even suicidality because of these issues. So it's a serious deal.
Yeah. And it affects marriages, sexual repression issues. It's very hard to turn on the switch right after it's been turned off. I mean, all those kinds of things. It's just one thing after another.
Yeah.
I would like to, if you don't mind, just since we're probably getting to the end, I'm guessing, of part 3 of my very long Mormon story.
We are.
But I would like to just I had planned to disclose 2 things about myself from a Mormon practice perspective. And that is that of tithing, and that is that of garments. So if you don't mind, I'd like to talk briefly about those 2 things.
Go for it.
So my relationship
get yourself in more trouble. Go.
Yeah, get myself in more trouble. Well, and again, I want to be clear that, first of all, the principle of tithing, I think, is a beautiful principle. I think that the idea of charity work and financial support of those who are suffering in ways that we cannot even fathom is absolutely important and should be a part of every religious, creed, and I think it is for the most part. So I'm completely supportive of the principle of tithing. I had an experience, I'm going to try to be very careful here, to be very careful about my confidentiality issues, but I've had many people, of course, through my office over the years that have experienced sexual abuse at the hands of church members, okay, whether it's a young men's leader, young women's leader, or bishoprics or whatever. So that in of itself is a whole nother podcast and very, very painful for a variety of reasons, as I'm sure most of you can imagine. And it was in one of these events that I felt like the police were informed correctly. Everything happened correctly. The police were informed. The person responsible was kept accountable. The family was informed. Everybody was doing the right thing, including the church, supporting this person getting therapy services, supporting the family, et cetera, et cetera. Years later, I come to find out that the church had offered this family, and now I know of other families, monies to basically have a minor sign a piece of paper where he or she agrees to not disclose their story outside, like in a memoir or something like that. So in other words, even though everything was on the up and up and everybody did the right thing, the church still felt a need to offer monies with something attached to it that has to do with silence, which we know in the therapy world is the number one thing you should not feel is silenced when you have gone through a trauma. And this was many years ago that this happened. And I had a discussion with Andy that night saying, I will not ever give one more cent to our church from here on out. So as a believing member, we decided to put our monies elsewhere. So we still paid tithing in the regard of being charitable with our monies, but not to the LDS church that would have monies go to these types of either legal types of fees or lawyers or anything that would have to do with anything to do with silencing trauma victims. I just will not support that. And I will still answer yes to, I'm a full tithing payer. So those are some of the issues that obviously a lot of bishops may not agree with me on. The second story is my garments. So again, I'm one that will completely honor religious garb, right? So lots of religions have different religious icons or symbols or things of that nature. And I think there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. I don't know that we need to be quite as rigid as we are with it in our culture, but I never had a problem wearing my garments. I never felt, I felt like I was okay with it from a personal perspective. I understand that there are a lot of problems and it's definitely not the sexiest way to present yourself to your spouse. So I'm all for lingerie, et cetera. That's, again, another podcast. But when it comes to the basic idea of having religious garb associated with a religious practice, there was nothing that I felt was incongruent with my beliefs on that. And the day that I found out that I had entered into a polygamous sealing ceremony without my knowledge and consent, I felt like the church had broken their covenant with me. And at that day is the day I took off my garment. And I actually had a very difficult time doing that. But covenants go both ways. And that was not my covenant with God. That was my covenant with the Mormon church. So they're off. And I'm starting to wear things where maybe that's a little bit more noticeable. So I just I want people to understand where that comes from. And that doesn't mean that I think everybody should take their garments off. These are, again, I want to speak from my personal experience. This is not me as a therapist or this is just my journey as a Mormon woman. So the day that they rescind polygamy and talk about that being a mistake that happened from a doctrinal perspective, I may consider renegotiating my covenants in a temple.
That's powerful. Thanks for sharing something so sensitive and so candid. And I hope it doesn't get you in trouble. What do you believe now that would still be considered Mormon doctrine? So what Mormon beliefs do you retain?
Well, and I think beliefs are hard, right? Because I have gotten very comfortable with beliefs being hopes, dreams. So again, my belief, I think with Mormons, belief is conflated with knowledge. We know things. So I'm not really one to say I know anything. I know nothing. However, I hope in many things, and I would say that there are things that have been very useful in my spiritual journey, whether they're literally true or not. So the idea of a feminine divine and a masculine divine, that's been very wonderful for me. The idea of a body being a gift, the idea of having this experience on this world for some type of purpose or learning experience is beautiful to me. The idea that progression is something that can happen on an ongoing basis, that there's no end stick, right, or measuring stick that gets you to an end point, like there's this eternal progression that can happen. I hope and believe that there could be the possibility of an afterlife where we can be with people that we love and care for and who've loved us. I mean, that would be a beautiful thing to have happen. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. It's useful to me. It helps me when somebody dies that I love very much, to have those kinds of thoughts and beliefs. And we're not alone in that as Mormons, obviously. There's lots of people who have those kinds of beliefs. And I'm okay with it being just a comforting thing. And if someday all I am is worm food, I'm not really going to care too much. But for right now, I do care. So it's a comforting belief. And I honor that hope in me. I think that the idea of even restoration is a beautiful idea, whether or not it's as literal as we would like it to think, but that there are things from the past that are of worth and that we can restore and have something happen currently that comes from the past. I think is an honoring of our ancestries. I think that there's great beauty in this idea of having a personal relationship with deity, where there's something that speaks in each of us, that we can have personal revelation, this idea that I don't have to go through another entity, that I can have that type of relationship myself and start to learn to trust my own inner workings as far as what speaks for me. Again, I don't know that we do a very good job of that culturally in Mormonism, but the idea is there.
Right. Okay. Are you comfortable sharing maybe some of the things you no longer believe that are distinctive and doctrinal, or would you rather not go into that? It's like truth claim stuff. Well,
I don't, again, through my Mormon mind, they're not non-doctrinal because I don't think they were doctrinal to begin with. That's kind of where I nuance things. But yeah, that's this idea that we're the only way back to God, right? And that our way is the only way, I think, is narcissistic and asinine. So that's ridiculous. I think that literal things where I think we've conflated history with spirituality. And so there's lots of historical things that I think are ridiculous for us to continue to believe. But that doesn't necessarily have to do anything with Mormon spirituality or doctrine. So, yeah, I mean,
do you see
probably.
What about do you have a sense for where the Book of Mormon came from?
Well, I think that it's as far as we can tell, it's not what the church claims it is currently. And a lot of times when people ask me, well, what do you think about Joseph Smith and the visions and the Book of Mormon? And my answer to that is, well, something happened. Maybe it was a psychotic break. I don't know. But something happened where people followed and people were edified and people have created a culture, and and for some reason I was adopted into that along the way. It's not my history. It's not my ancestry, right? And so you all are way too connected to your history with your religion, right? I mean, that's just ridiculous. Nobody's religion can stand up to history. So Mormonism just, I think, got it wrong in that way. Why we study history as part of our church service is ridiculous to me, because you're going to come up with problems, because history deals with people. And people are a disaster for the most part. We all are.
And so, if things like Joseph's polygamy, I'm imagining you aren't a fan of Joseph's polygamy, right?
No, I'm not.
So if you don't believe that was of God, and he claimed it was, and if you don't believe the Book of Mormon is kind of what the church claims it is, some people just say, well, then Joseph was like conning people or fooling people, so I can't belong to a church that he founded. How do you get around that yourself?
Well, first of all, I think that's a perfectly okay thing to think. And there's lots of people who legitimately leave for those reasons. And I think that's perfectly valid. Again, for me, I feel like I would be dealing with a lot less people in my life if I had those standards for everybody who I deal with, including myself. There's days that I think I've done an amazing job as a mother and I probably sucked. And there's other days, but does that mean that I'm conning or that I'm abusive? I mean, maybe, but I don't know that we're all as self-aware as we'd like to think we are.
And I could hear an audience member saying, yeah, but propositioning other men's wives and 14-year-olds.
Oh, it was ridiculous. It was totally abusive.
But it's not even on the same scale as making a mistake as a mom. So maybe some would say you're trivializing the severity of what Joseph did.
Well, I hope I'm not trivializing the severity of what he did. I think that, quite frankly, he did have probably mental health issues. I do think that he was probably had a personality disorder of some sort. And he probably, for whatever reason, people follow charismatic leaders the wrong way all the time, as we can see right now, quite frankly, with our president of this country. So yeah, there's all kinds of problems with power and leaders and dynamics that happen from a mental health perspective that we can follow. But for me, my Mormonism was never about Joseph Smith. My Mormonism was about something much bigger than that. So I understand that the church has shot themselves in the foot when they say things like, if you don't believe in this, and if you don't believe in this, then the whole thing is falling apart. Well, then, duh, the whole thing falls apart. They're idiots for saying that kind of stuff, because the evidence is right there for the whole thing to fall apart if we're all basing our Mormonism on some of the idiotic things that Joseph Smith did. So at the same time, there was a movement, there was something that happened there that's what I'm willing to honor. I'm willing to honor the people who sacrificed, and whatever happened led to the point where my parents had two young men knock at their door, and that changed the course of my life in a way that I will never get away from. And I'm willing to honor that.
And now you're going back.
And now I'm going back.
After stepping away for 5 years.
Yeah, so we'll see how that goes. You can interview me again in 5 more years.
Or 6 months.
Yeah, or 6 months.
I'm just kidding. Totally kidding. Totally kidding. Natasha Helfer Parker, you're one of my favorite people on the planet. And we've had a lot of people last this full 3-4 hours. So
that's amazing.
It's been a beautiful, heartwarming episode. I want to thank everyone who's been tuning in. Do you have any final thoughts or final perspectives, a final sort of testimony of sorts that you would want to share with our listeners as we wrap up this wonderful interview?
Well, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to be on and share my Mormon story, which I purposefully have not really shared a lot of these things in the past, like I talked about at the very beginning with my own boundaries and things. So I think it's very healing to be able to have a place to share one's narrative. And that's in essence what therapy services are a lot about, is sharing our narrative, sharing our stories with a witness who will honor your story as you share it. So in a sense, any of you who are listening to this, you're honoring me in that way. And that's very meaningful and very lovely. And I think that's whatever we want to say about our Mormonism and however we've been harmed by it, it never ceases to amaze me that its product is amazing people. Amazing people. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I'm honored to be counted among you all. And for me, you all can mean anywhere on the spectrum, you know, from our polygamist cousins who are still practicing to those of you who the last thing you'd want to have attributed to you is being Mormon in any way, shape, or fashion. So I'm just honored to be a part of this community.
Well, Natasha Helfer Parker, you're a gift to Mormonism and you're a gift to me as a friend. So I love you and thanks for joining us. Thank
you, John. I'm so glad to call you friend as well.
Listen, Jenny writes, you totally rock. I really appreciate your point of view. Steve writes, Natasha, you're always a delight. I love your laugh and your great attitude. Thanks for being so vulnerable for us. This was a terrific interview. Kyle writes, where can we see this posted? I'm guessing, Kyle, next week we'll post it to mormonstories.org, but also, Kyle, in probably less than an hour, it'll show up on the Mormon Stories podcast Facebook page, and you can just rewatch it there as much as you want. Colleen writes, loved every minute. This was revolutionary. Sherry writes, I love and appreciate your open authenticity. Sarah writes, thank you for sharing yourself, Natasha. You've lifted me. Joyce writes, love you, Natasha and John. Thanks for a great afternoon. Thanks, Joyce. Randy writes, you have such a huggable soul. So Randy says you have a huggable soul.
Thank you.
I think that's true. Sherry writes, you summed it up with including everyone. Thank you. And Crystal gives you 3 hearts with sparkly little sparkles on the hearts.
The sparkles matter.
Yeah. And Glenn, thanks for joining us the whole time. All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. For those of you who support the Open Stories Foundation and these podcasts, thank you. We couldn't do it without you. For those of you who are free writers, who don't support us, who don't offer donations, please consider 10 or 20 or 50 or $100 a month, whatever you can afford. Go to the podcast you enjoy, click on the donate button at the top right, and please donate, because this stuff saves lives, saves marriages, helps people, and it helps you, or you wouldn't be listening. So please support it, because it makes it possible. Please check out Mormon Mental Health Podcast at Mormon Mental Health podcast.org, I think it is.
It's mormonmentalhealth.org.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Check out Symmetry Souls, SOLS.com, for a therapist. If you need a good Mormon therapist, check out symmetrysouls.com. Check out Mormon Sex Info if you want a great podcast on Mormon sex, which I'm sure is similar and sometimes dissimilar to regular sex, Mormon sex. But that's Natasha's great podcast. Check out the Mormon Therapist blog and tune in again for more cool episodes on Mormon Stories. Natasha, we love you. Thanks again.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. We'll see you guys soon.